Welcome to another session of IntelliQuest's The World's 100 Greatest Books audio series. We'll feature the work of the 18th century English writer Daniel Defoe. We'll consider Defoe's novel Moll Flanders, the adventurous story of a woman from the lower classes who struggles hard to survive and eventually devotes herself to a life of crime. In the course of the story, Moll is seduced by a wealthy young man, marries 5 times, including one marriage to her own half-brother, has 10 children, makes 2 trips to the American colonies, is imprisoned and sentenced to death, and finally repents and settles into a happy, prosperous life as a plantation owner. Defoe tries to make his readers believe it was a true story, although it was, of course, entirely fiction. Nevertheless, he uses many devices to create realism, and the resulting style redefined fictional writing and paved the way for the appearance of the true modern novel. Defoe is considered the inventor of the realistic novel. The devices he used to create this realism included ones he'd already experimented with in Robinson Crusoe 2 years before. For instance, Moll tells the story herself in a first-person narrative. She is 70 years old when the story opens and is reflecting back on her life. Her name, by the way, is not really Moll. She doesn't tell us her true name because of her scandalous past. Defoe also achieves a realistic effect by concentrating on details. His descriptions of London and its inhabitants and of the many objects Moll steals are full and concrete. The atmosphere of the city and its times comes vividly to life. The characters are a colorful collection of scoundrels and gentlemen, wenches and ladies. Defoe takes his readers on an inside tour of the slums of London, and during the 1700s, those slums were among the worst in the world. This kind of naturalistic picture of everyday life was very rare before Defoe's time, and is one of his greatest contributions to literature. Another realistic technique Defoe uses is Moll's periodic inability to remember details, such as the name of the inn she stayed in on one particular escapade. Real people do forget things, particularly when looking back from the age of 70. These natural lapses of memory help convince us of the accuracy of what she does remember. Finally, Defoe adds to the realistic tone of his novel by constantly digressing from the main story. Moll is always interrupting herself and getting sidetracked by little events and anecdotes which have nothing to do with the main plot. To some critics, this is a fault of the novel and makes it seem disjointed. To others, it makes Moll sound more natural and authentic. There are reasons that Defoe felt it important to make his novel realistic, but none of them have to do with the desire to be a literary pioneer. Instead, he was motivated by practical concerns. He wanted his works to sell. Defoe was plagued by debts and creditors, and only resorted to fiction after many years as an unsuccessful businessman. He was in his 60s when he wrote Moll Flanders, and was trying to develop a new means of support. Unlike other writers of his time, like Jonathan Swift, writing was not an intellectual pastime or the pursuit of high art. It was, in effect, a trade. So it was essential that his books be popular. One of the types of books that was very popular among the lower and middle classes of that time were books about rogues, criminals, and the underworld of English society. People found this back-alley life and its disreputable characters to be titillating. And if they thought the story was true, or at least based on truth, or if at least they could pretend it was true, then all the better. So it's likely that Defoe used this technique to please his readers and to attain as wide a readership as possible. Defoe may even have gone a little too far in his quest for the sensational. Some of his critics were appalled at his vulgarity, feeling the book portrayed the seamy side of life in more sordid detail than was necessary. Today, of course, Moll Flanders seems very mild. Defoe may have also gone to such lengths to convince his readers the story was true, because there was still a belief at that time, held over from the Greeks, that fiction was a form of lying, and that only true stories had value. Remember that at this point in history the novel had not yet been invented. To the people in Defoe's age, writing had to be instructive. There had to be a message or a lesson. If it was also entertaining, that was acceptable, but of secondary importance. That is why Defoe presents Moll Flanders' life as an autobiography with a lesson. And that is why she looks back on her life as an old woman and repents her sinfulness. This sort of moral preaching is awkward or even offensive to modern readers, but to the readers of 18th century England it was a requirement. They expected and demanded it. And Defoe, who had strong middle-class values, was pleased to deliver. He introduces the novel by saying it's intended to be a deterrent to crime and an example of the rewards of repentance. He fully intended the moral message of the book to be taken seriously. The chief vehicle for Defoe's message is, of course, Moll Flanders herself. She is really the only main character in the book. The others are all minor and subordinate. In fact, with only one or two exceptions, they don't even have names. They're referred to instead as her husband, or the gentleman from Bath, or the nurse. This is Moll's story, and the others are just her supporting cast. Before we begin that story, here's a brief background on Moll and a few of the people who enter and exit her tumultuous life. Moll Flanders is supposedly writing the book upon her return to England in her old age. She reflects back on a life in which she's basically been a product of circumstances, a victim of several unlucky twists of fate. She is an ambitious and clever woman who wants to rise above her station in life, but who is never given the chance. As a result, she resorts to immoral and illegal acts which eventually end her up in prison. But almost all of these acts are committed for survival. Moll is self-reliant and brave, as most of Defoe's heroes are, including Robinson Crusoe. She also has a sense of humor and a rather naive optimism that enables her to keep putting her faith in a variety of schemes and people that she hopes will bring her the security she longs for. Moll's first husband. He's one of the few characters who has a name, and his name is Robert, or Robin, as he's called by his family. He's the younger son in a middle-class family that opposes his marriage to the penniless Moll, but his love for her is genuine. Unfortunately, he dies 5 years after they're married. Moll's second husband, a man Defoe describes as this amphibious creature, this land-water thing called a gentleman tradesman. He spends money lavishly, and soon after their marriage is bankrupt. He flees to France to avoid arrest, and is never seen again. Moll's third husband. Moll thinks he's rich, and he thinks she's rich, but after they marry, they discover they were both wrong. Following a move to the American colonies, they discover he's really Moll's half-brother, so they separate. He attempts suicide unsuccessfully, and then contracts a lingering illness. Moll's fourth husband. He has a name, too. It's James, but Moll calls him Jemmy, and he's the only one for whom she has a genuine passion. He turns out to be a highwayman, and they separate, but are reunited later in prison. Moll's fifth husband. Moll's next husband is a bank clerk. She, by the way, never bothers to divorce her husbands. Divorce in England at that time was an expensive and difficult process. Husband number 5 is meticulous and proper. He shows up at their marriage ceremony with legal proof of the divorce from his first wife, her death certificate, and the verdict of the coroner. The midwife. The midwife assists Moll when she gives birth to Jemmy's child, and later assists her when she enters a life of crime. She becomes Moll's fence for stolen goods, and later her partner. She's very businesslike and is devoted to Moll, helping her later when she's imprisoned and sentenced to death. Moll begins her story by telling us the name Moll was given to her by the low comrades with whom she kept company during her life of crime. Her real name is well known in the records of the Old Bailey and Newgate jails, but she prefers not to tell us what it is. Her mother was sentenced to death for being a thief, the traditional sentence in those days, but she was granted a reprieve because she was pregnant. Moll was born in prison. After she was born, her mother was transported to the American colonies, leaving Moll behind. She was adopted by a band of gypsies, a period of her life of which she has little memory, and was later abandoned by them in the town of Colchester in Essex. The magistrates of that town took pity on her because she was only 3 years old, and turned her over to a woman who ran a small local school. Moll says her upbringing was mannerly and well-ordered. She became adept at sewing, and her skills made her popular with the ladies in the town. She told her guardian, whom she called Nurse, that she wanted to become a gentlewoman someday. Moll was 14 when her guardian died, and she had the good fortune to be taken in by one of the ladies in the town, who gave her the same genteel education and care she gave her own 2 daughters, and she was taught French, dancing, and music. By the time she was 18, Moll was very pretty with a good voice, well educated, and trained in all the social graces. The 2 sons of the lady began to take an interest in her. The elder son was a roué who flattered and fussed over Moll, and promised to marry her when his father died and he came into his inheritance. She was seduced by his charm and became his secret lover. Soon she discovered he had no intention at all of marrying her, and about the same time the younger brother proclaimed his love for her. This brother, Robin, was genuine in his affections, and willing to ignore the objections of his family. His mother found Moll's social status and poverty unacceptable, and his sisters protested simply because they were jealous of Moll's beauty and popularity. The older brother, however, supported the marriage and encouraged Moll to say yes. He said his father showed no signs of dying, and if he married Moll now, he'd be disinherited. Moll refused to marry Robin. She still loved the older brother, and besides, as the eldest, he would inherit the estate. But when the older brother told her they could no longer be lovers, whether or not she married Robin, and when Robin persisted in his proposals, Moll gave in and married him. He was a kind husband, and Moll had 2 children by him, but she didn't love him and always wished for his brother. When he died 5 years later, she left the children with their paternal grandparents and set out on her own. She had enough money to support herself for a while, but knew she would soon have to remarry. Moll had many admirers to choose from, and she considered each one carefully. Finally, she selected a shopkeeper who seemed stable, but turned out to be a spendthrift. He wasted his money and her own on lavish entertainment and travels, and was soon in trouble with creditors. He was arrested and escaped, fleeing to France. Moll received 1 letter from him, and then never heard from him again. She had a child from this marriage, but it later died. At that point, Moll took up private lodgings and changed her name to Mrs. Flanders. There seemed no way for an educated middle-class woman to support herself. The only respectable work was as a seamstress or taking care of children, but neither paid well enough. She felt she had 2 choices in life: to become someone's mistress or to make a good marriage. To be a mistress, one only needed good looks, but Moll was older now and felt her looks were fading. To marry well, one needed a handsome sum of money. So Moll encouraged rumors that she was a wealthy widow. The rumors worked. She was married to a man who owned a plantation in Virginia, and who also seemed to possess a handsome income. After the marriage, they both confessed their true financial status, and neither was what the other supposed. Her husband was disappointed, but Moll was clearly blameless, since she had never claimed she was rich herself. She had simply allowed the rumors of her wealth to go unchecked. In spite of his disappointment, her husband treated her well, and they decided to live in Virginia, where he might take a more active part in running his plantation, and perhaps increase its profits. Once in Virginia, Moll met his mother, who lived on the plantation, and she settled into a comfortable life as a colonist. It's at this point that fate took a dreadful turn for Moll. One day her husband's mother told Moll the story of her life. It was a familiar story, and when the woman finally mentioned her maiden name, Moll fainted. She had been talking to her own mother. She had married her half-brother. Now she was expecting another child and didn't know what to do. Moll felt sick, but she told her mother it was only because the story had been so depressing. Then she vowed to herself to keep her news secret from both her mother and her husband. If her husband found out, she would surely lose him, and then she'd be worse off than before. For 3 years, Moll continued this incestuous relationship, but as time passed, the weight of her secret became too much, and she finally confided in her mother. Her mother was shocked and advised her not to tell her husband, but Moll found it increasingly difficult to live with him, knowing what she knew. He detected her aversion to him, and soon there were many quarrels. The marriage became so unhappy that Moll confessed the truth to him. He fainted, and when he came to, slipped into a deep melancholy that eventually led to 2 suicide attempts. Moll wanted to return to England, but then she thought she might stay in Virginia. If her husband died, she would be free to make an advantageous marriage. However, the 2 agreed they must part from each other, although they each promised to keep in touch. Moll returned to England after receiving his promise he would give her financial support. It was support that was not forthcoming. In England she settled in the resort of Bath, where she had a landlady who was determined to find her a gentleman who could care for her. It didn't take long to accomplish that goal, and soon Moll found herself the subject of much attention and favor from a well-to-do man who was married, but whose wife was insane. The man had principles and agreed to a platonic relationship with Moll. She, in turn, refused to take advantage of him, in spite of the encouragement of her landlady, who wanted her to practice those little deceits designed to gain money from wealthy and vulnerable men. He admired Moll's integrity and honesty and developed a sincere love for her, a love which increased after she nursed him back to health after a serious illness. The two traveled together to Gloucester, where the only lodging they could find was one room with 2 beds, separated by a curtain. Since they had trouble talking to each other through the curtain, he joined her in her bed, promising not to injure her virtue. To Moll's amazement, this attempt to defy the laws of nature actually worked. Moll and her gentleman returned to Bristol and lived together platonically. But one night they both drank too much wine, and Moll told him he was released from his promise. Moll had a child by the man and continued to live with him when he wasn't in the company of his lawful wife. 6 years later the man fell ill with pleurisy, and during his illness he repented, vowing to end his relationship with Moll when he recovered. She tried, but could not persuade him to continue with her, although he did say he would take care of their child. So she found herself once again alone, with some savings, but no future means of support. Moll was then 42 years old, and though she looked much younger, she felt it would be more difficult to attract a man who could support her. She decided to take the moderate sum of money she'd saved and entrust it to someone with financial skills. She was recommended to a bank clerk who was said to be reliable and trustworthy. The clerk advised her on some sensible investments and also fell instantly in love with her. He proposed marriage, but there was a complication that disturbed Moll. He had a wife who'd run away with another man, and it would take a long time to get a divorce from her. He asked Moll to make a promise of marriage in writing to be fulfilled when the divorce was obtained. She said she would think about it. About this time, Moll's fortunes took another turn. She met a woman who offered to introduce her to her brother, James. She said James owned a large estate in the north of England and had a sizable income. This woman was under the false impression that Moll had considerable amounts of money herself, and Moll did nothing to correct her opinion. She soon married James, whom she called Jemmy. She felt a little guilty about deserting the bank clerk, but the idea of her newfound wealth quickly erased such thoughts. Soon after, she discovered the entire marriage had been a plot. The woman was not James's sister, but his mistress, and she received a large reward for bringing him a wealthy wife. James, of course, had no estate, and had spent what money he did have trying to entertain and impress Moll. Both were disappointed to find out the truth about each other. James, in fact, went into a terrible rage and stormed out. But when he calmed down, he returned and was reluctant to part from her. She tried to talk him into going to Virginia to start a plantation, but he felt he could do as well in Ireland. It was agreed he'd go to Ireland and try farming, and if he was unsuccessful, he'd agree to go to America. Moll returned to London while James left for Ireland on this scheme she hoped would make them rich. Back in London, Moll discovered she was pregnant again. She also started receiving letters from the smitten bank clerk, who said his wife had committed suicide and he was now free to marry Moll. She managed to put him off until she gave birth to her baby. She found a midwife whose specialty was helping unmarried or deserted women, and stayed with her until the child was born. The midwife helped her place the baby in a good home with a countrywoman, who required only a small yearly remuneration. Moll managed to conceal all this from the bank clerk, and when it was over she married him. He showed up on their wedding day with all the documents necessary to prove his wife was dead, and indeed had killed herself. They spent that night at an inn, and Moll was terrified when she saw her husband Jemmy entering a nearby tavern with 2 other men. At first she thought he was looking for her, but then she saw that the 3 were being pursued and that they were wanted as highwaymen. Moll threw off the pursuers by saying she saw one of the men and knew him to be an honest gentleman. However, she was now suspicious of Jemmy. Moll remained with her fifth husband, the bank clerk, for 5 years, devoting herself to being a good wife and housekeeper. She had 2 more children. Then another disaster struck. Her husband placed too much trust in a fellow bank clerk, and the man mismanaged their funds. They were bankrupt. Her husband became despondent, suffered a long illness, and died. Now Moll was again without funds or support, and she was in a state of despair. Over the next 2 years she sold whatever belongings she had. Her poverty was oppressive, and she began to remember the prayer, "Give me not poverty, lest I steal." In retrospect, she comments on how true that prayer is. One evening she passed by a shop and saw a parcel sitting on the floor unattended. Without any premeditation, she reached in and grabbed it. It was her first theft, and she was overcome with fear. Inside the bag she found silver, lace, and other valuable objects, which she sold for a significant sum. The second theft was easier. Moll followed a little girl coming out of a dancing school and offered to help her home. The child was wearing a gold necklace. She held the girl's hand as they walked, and when they passed through a dark alley, she removed the necklace without the girl being aware. Then she directed the child home. Moll didn't feel guilty about this crime. She thought it was a lesson to the parents for permitting such a young child to parade valuables, and she also thought the mother of the girl should have picked her up at school. After that, Moll found many opportunities for stealing. She enlarged her field of activity to the suburbs of London. She tried to give up this life of thievery by doing some needlework, but she found it hard to find work without contacts in society. This embittered her so that she returned to crime with a vengeance. Even though she was no longer destitute, she found the temptations too great. She began shoplifting and pickpocketing. Moll needed a better, more profitable way of selling her stolen goods, so she went to the midwife for help. The midwife served as her fence, and from then on Moll received the highest prices for what she stole. For a time Moll took a partner, a young woman, but the woman was arrested when she was in possession of some goods that Moll had stolen. Moll was glad she hadn't revealed her identity to the girl. She was relieved when the girl was transported, because she was then too far away to be a witness against Moll. Soon after, Moll saw a house on fire, and she ran in under the pretense of helping, but instead made off with all the valuable goods she could carry. By then she had developed a reputation among the other thieves, who envied her ability to escape detection. It was they who nicknamed her Moll. One day she was wearing the costume of a widow, and was looking about for an opportunity to pursue her craft. Suddenly she heard shouts of, "Stop thief! Stop thief!" and saw an angry mob pursuing a thief. The shouts came closer, and suddenly Moll was grabbed and dragged into the shop where the crime had occurred. By coincidence, Moll was dressed the same way the thief had been dressed. The other woman had stolen some merchandise and fled from the store into the streets. Moll insisted to the shop people that it was a case of mistaken identity. She spoke and acted like such a lady that the owner of the shop believed her, but his helper insisted Moll was the shoplifter. Moll became very indignant because this was one crime of which she was completely innocent. Other witnesses, who said she was not the right woman, got into an argument with the shop assistant, who still claimed she was guilty. A constable had to be called. He listened to the whole story, and eventually the matter ended up in court. The judge ruled that Moll had been mistreated and ordered that she be compensated. She received a sizable sum, which, when added to the large amount of money she'd already accumulated from her thefts, gave Moll confidence in her financial security. She thought she was just about the wealthiest thief in London, but still she continued her crimes. She tried smuggling until she became too well known among the smugglers. She tried stealing a horse, but she didn't know what to do with it once she had it. She tried her luck in the country, but she missed London and returned to its familiar streets. Then she decided to abandon her life of crime. She was determined to start life over again. Unfortunately, Moll discovered that she was addicted to her new occupation and couldn't resist the many temptations that came her way. It was about this time that her luck suddenly changed. Moll was caught leaving a shop with expensive fabrics tucked under her cloak. She protested that she fully intended to buy them, but everyone just laughed, and she soon found herself hauled off to Newgate prison. The prisoners there recognized her as the notorious Moll Flanders, and took great pleasure in seeing her humbled. Her friend the midwife tried to help her by offering bribes to the witnesses and the shop owner, but her attempts failed. Moll's trial came up, and she tried to convince the judge that she was just taking the fabric out towards the light so she could see it better and could decide whether to buy it. The argument was weak. She hadn't been arrested in a retail shop. She'd been arrested in a broker's house. She was found guilty of felony and acquitted of burglary, but since both carried the death penalty, it made little difference. Moll was back in prison, surrounded by other poor souls condemned to die, and their wailings drove her almost insane. Because she had money, she was able to pay for the most comfortable conditions in the prison, but she was still despondent at how her life had gone full circle. She was back in jail where she had been born. Moll finally broke down and poured out her whole life story to the prison's minister. When she thought of the delights of heaven she had sacrificed, just for some transient earthly pleasures, she was filled with sincere regrets. The minister was very moved and went to the authorities to appeal on her behalf. When Moll saw the execution of other condemned prisoners, she cried hysterically and then was moved by gratitude to be alive. Meanwhile, she had one day seen her fourth husband, Jemmy, being brought into Newgate as a prisoner. His escapades as a highwayman had finally caught up with him. Moll visited Jemmy, who was stunned to see her, and found out that the evidence against him was very weak. She told him to ask for a reprieve. In lieu of the death penalty, some convicted felons were sent to America and sold as indentured servants. But Jemmy railed against this idea. He said he'd rather be hung than work as a slave. Moll told him it wasn't the same as slavery, and eventually he could be free again and even find a way to return to England. Soon after, Moll discovered the pleas of the minister had been successful, and she herself had gained a reprieve, just the day before she was to hang. Now she was to be shipped to America as an indentured servant. She tried once again to convince Jemmy to do the same thing, and this time she was successful. He applied for a reprieve, and it was granted. The two sailed for America. Moll said, "And in the 61st year of my age, I launched out into a new world." On the way to America, they made friends with the captain of the ship. When the ship arrived in Virginia, Moll and Jemmy were sold as servants to a planter as required. However, the friendly ship captain made a financial arrangement with the planter that ensured the sale was only a formality. They were now free to go wherever they liked. Jemmy and Moll pooled their resources. Both had managed to store away some of their ill-gained money, and they bought some land. Moll made inquiries and found that her mother had died, but one day she saw her half-brother, now old and nearly blind, and her son, who was handsome and looked prosperous. After they passed, Moll fell to the ground and kissed it. Later she discovered that when her mother had died, she left a sum of money for her daughter, should she ever return. She didn't know how to collect it without letting Jemmy find out this dark secret of her past. Moll and Jemmy left for Carolina, where she thought she would have less chance of being recognized. Her plan was that once Jemmy was in Carolina, she could make a trip back to collect her inheritance. They got as far as Maryland, and, exhausted, settled there instead. They bought a rich piece of land and 2 servants, and soon they cleared 50 acres and planted tobacco. Moll wrote to her son, and he came to see her, bringing with him her share of the inheritance her mother had left. With this additional money, Moll's plantation flourished, and she and Jemmy were soon prosperous. She made her son her heir, since he was the only one of her children whose whereabouts she knew. Her good fortune moved her to thank Providence, and she felt much remorse for her past life. Secure at last, both she and Jemmy repented their sinful ways. Jemmy joked that in spite of what he thought after he first married her, she was an heiress after all. In their 2nd year in America, Moll went once again to visit her son. She discovered that her brother had died. It was then that she told Jemmy the entire story of her incestuous marriage. Years later, the couple returned to England. They were old now, but Moll tells us they're both in good health. Looking back over her 70 years, she says she's done many wicked things she can't change, but the remainder of her life will be spent in repentance. That is her sincere resolve. This is the ending of Moll Flanders, and it's an ending that predictably brings out the cynic in many modern critics. Moll and Jemmy have fully repented, but they've repented because they're finally prosperous, and have no further need to steal. The moral could easily be misread as, give up your sins, but wait first until you have a decent income. This, of course, isn't what Defoe intended. What he did intend was, first of all, to suggest that crime is often a matter of circumstance. Moll isn't morally strong, but nevertheless we can see she was driven to crime as a result of her own bad luck and an impossibly difficult social system. This system offered no opportunities or help for single women of the lower class, with no family or other support. There were few respectable jobs available to them, and men sought wives who had either good looks or wealth. Moll's actions were taken out of necessity for survival. She acts from her feeling that she is completely alone, alienated from society even from her birth, and can depend only on herself for economic security. You may recall that Defoe went bankrupt and was pursued by creditors during his life. As a result, he had a keen awareness of and sensitivity for the depressed classes. For many of them, the only choices were starvation or crime, and to Defoe it was man's duty to survive. This was the primary motivation in Robinson Crusoe, and it's the primary motivation in Moll Flanders. Defoe was also a member of the middle class, and was a dissenter to the Church of England. This group associated business success with moral righteousness. To fail in your business was the worst evil. The individual proved his spiritual worthiness by becoming as successful as possible. The effect of this philosophy is seen in Defoe's own life, in his repeated attempts to find a profitable business, his switching from trade to trade, and his determination to make his writings popular with as broad a readership as possible. He was, in many ways, like Moll herself. She seeks always to turn things to her financial advantage, whether it be relationships or skills, including the skills that lead her to a life of crime. Moll is ready to try anything to earn a living: marriage, being a mistress, theft, farming, England, Ireland, or America. She is self-sufficient, even though she strives over and over to find someone else who can provide her with the security she longs for. And she is not analytical or introspective about her behavior, but she does eventually triumph. Like Crusoe, she overcomes adversity and bad luck, and survives an environment that is hostile and friendless. However, while Crusoe repents at his lowest point, Moll doesn't repent until she's reached her highest point. Defoe says in the book that he edited Moll's story and made it into a tract against wickedness. The wickedness was obviously intended to be Moll's, but there is also much wickedness in the society in which she must survive. Defoe had written before about the necessity of taking care of children, particularly orphans and children of outcasts. Moll was born in prison, and although at first she was well cared for, she was deprived of any station in life and any financial support or future. Defoe also wrote about the slums and the desperate forces that overtake people confined in them, a theme that's developed fully in Moll Flanders. And he protested the penal system of England, particularly the brutal penalties for minor crimes and the punishment of debtors. These issues also come to play in the book. Still, Defoe's main intention was to write a riveting and colorful story about the low life of 18th century England that would attract the large base of unintellectual middle-class readers. At the same time, he hoped to sketch a clear and simple moral about the ill effects of crime and the virtue of repentance. In the process, he created a book so realistic and innovative for the times that it has forever earned a place in the history of literature, and he will forever be respected as one of the inventors of the modern novel.
This is the end of the session.